Hello and welcome. Thank you for logging on and attending this evening's virtual program. My name is Matt Schumann. I am on the programming team here at Cary Library. Before we begin, please let me know if there are any technical issues that I can try to resolve. You can ask in the chat. Questions can otherwise be asked in the Q&A. This program is made possible by the generous donors to the Cary Library Foundation, and it is in partnership with the Lexington Historical Society. With us this evening is David Kruh, author of several books and dozens of columns for the Boston Globe and Boston Herald. His research for a film on Charles Ponzi resulted in tonight's presentation. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce Sarah McDonough from the Lexington Historical Society.
Thank you so much for having me, Matt. So as you just heard, my name is Sarah. I'm the programs manager at the Lexington Historical Society, and we are so happy to be co-sponsoring this event tonight. Both of our organizations have luckily, due to the nature of what we do, been able to largely maneuver our programming online. So we're very happy to be able to continue to collaborate with the library as much as possible. And we are planning many fun things over the course of the year, some of which were already planned, some of which are new. Our next big event is going to be on July 20th, which is with the author Rick Atkinson, who wrote the book The British Are Coming, which is one of our great new Revolutionary War books. And we are also going to be splitting a number of events over the course of the summer and fall that are involved with the Lexington Remembers World War II larger celebration, because there is just so much to explore with this particular subject matter. There are some things that the Historical Society is handling, some things that the library is handling. So we're very excited to continue to collaborate now and in the future. And so hopefully, if you all enjoy this program, you'll continue to look at the calendars for both of our organizations. So carylibrary.org/calendar and lexingtonhistory.org/events. All right, I think that covers all of our upcoming programs. So without further ado, I would like to give the hypothetical microphone over to David Kruh. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
It's my pleasure. I want to thank the library and the Historical Society for having me. It's a special treat because we do have a Lexington connection tonight as we talk about a financial scam that is so outrageous, so audacious, and so bloody successful that today we still invoke the name of the perpetrator when talking about similar scams. I'm, of course, talking about a man named Charles Ponzi. So how Charles Ponzi came to Boston is a story unto itself. He was born in Parma, Italy, in northern Italy in 1893, of middle-class parents. They could afford to send him to university, where Carlo, as he was then known, was something of a dilettante, and they decided what he needed was some toughening up in America. So they put him on a steamer, $200 in his pocket, which he promptly lost in a shipboard poker game, and he came to America. But instead of getting this hard-labored relative at in New York, he kind of floated around the East Coast. He was in Pittsburgh and Providence and New Haven. He was a kitchen help, a grocery clerk, a factory hand, and so exactly how. He ended up here in Montreal, where he worked at the Banco Zarossi as a bank teller. So this man with zero banking experience, he becomes one of the favorites of Mr. Zarossi. And it turns out Zarossi took a liking to this young man and confided in him that he'd made some bad investments. Well, Ponzi tells a friend of his named Scarpini, and this part of the story can get pretty complicated, and we want to get to the Boston part sooner. I'll just say this. They convinced Zarossi to forge some checks promising they would not cash them. They simply wanted them as kind of an insurance policy so we wouldn't double cross them. Well, Scarpini got Ponzi to actually cash one of those checks, and then he turned him in to the Canadian authorities, who promptly set him up here for the next 2 years at the St. Vincent de Paul Penitentiary. When Ponzi finished his sentence, he then got a job as a translator. At least that's what he says in his autobiography. In truth, he was hired to smuggle 5 Italian laborers across the border from Canada into the United States. They were caught, and Mr. Ponzi then spent another year as the guest of the United States government here at the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta. So Ponzi, he finishes his term at the penitentiary. He gets a job at a power and light company. He kind of drifts his way up the East Coast, and he finds himself here in Boston around 1919. Now, this is a really interesting time, not only in Boston history, but in American history. We, of course, have the imminent prohibition, which would ban the sale of alcohol in this country. It's also a time of the first great Red Scare. This is a picture on the Boston Common of people waiting to hear one of the many orators opining for a new system of government here in America. We can't forget that World War I had ended in 1919, and with the returning servicemen came a pandemic. We all know what that's like now, don't we? And this was the Spanish flu epidemic of 1919 and 1920. The suffragettes were finally going to get the vote for women in 1920. But before that, in Boston, on a cold January day in 1919, a molasses tank filled with 1 million gallons of thick, syrupy molasses exploded, killing 23 people, injuring hundreds more, and forever leaving a slightly molasses smell to the north end of Boston on a hot summer's day. This was also the rise of the Ku Klux Klan following World War II. It's the time of the Black Sox scandal and the loss of innocence in America. And it is in this world to which Charles Ponzi came to Boston in 1919. Boston at the time was being under the influence of himself, James Michael Curley, who was helping to ratchet up the tension between the immigrants and the Yankees. No small part that would have in our story tonight. Finally, in September of 1919 was the great Boston police strike, in which all but a few members of the Boston Police Department went out on strike. I mentioned the Red Scare. This motivated the governor of Massachusetts, a guy you may have heard of, Calvin Coolidge, to bring in the state militia, who would take over for our police force and patrol the city's streets for a year. So now Charles Ponzi arrives in Boston. He gets himself a small flat in Somerville, and he gets a job with the J.R. Poole Company, an importer and exporter located in the Italian section of the city. Now, we don't know exactly what happened here at J.R. Poole. We only know that 6 months after he started working, he was fired from J.R. Poole. So down on his luck, no job. He then meets Rose Necco. He meets her on a Boston trolley. He would later write in his autobiography that she was, quote, the greatest gift America bestowed on me. Rose not only became his wife, but she also got him a job with her uncle, who ran the Necco Fruit Company. Now, we don't know exactly what went down at the Necco Fruit Company. We only know that 6 months after they hired him, the whole operation went under. Now, Ponzi once again finds himself looking for a way to make a name for himself, to make some money, and he decides to publish a magazine. Now, looking back, first of all, it was a pretty brazen thing, again, for this totally inexperienced man to come up with the idea of a magazine. But it actually was a pretty clever idea. It was a loose leaf binder. And in those loose leaf binders, he would put in articles and exchange rates and other information for people in various countries: Spain, France, Italy, Romania. And depending upon what country would subscribe, he would slide in the pages that had the information in that local language. It's really a very clever idea. Unfortunately, the Neckos won't invest. Gee, I wonder why. And he finds himself in December of 1919 so down on his luck that he has to give a promissory note to a furniture dealer so he can hang on to his desk, chair, and loan file cabinet. And now it's mid-December 1919. Charles Ponzi's magazine is not selling. He owes money to the furniture dealer. He desperately wants to make a good life for himself and for Rose. And here's when this wonderful moment happens. And he describes it in his autobiography as he tears open the envelope from a correspondent in Spain. This little piece of paper floats down to his desk. This is an international reply coupon. Now, according to an international agreement, about 30 countries would respect the coupon to be exchanged for any first-class stamp in any country. So you would buy the coupon, let's say, in Boston. He would stick it in the envelope and send the envelope to his correspondent in Spain, who, to ensure that he could return the whatever correspondence there was, would go to his local post office, get a first-class stamp, and be able to mail it back. It was kind of an early version of a self-addressed stamped envelope, guaranteeing postage, returned, addressed. And that's when Ponzi had this epiphany, this shattering moment, which would change his life and the lives of thousands. He figured out how one could make money from the international reply coupon. I'm going to show you how he did it. Everything I'm about to show you was completely legal in 1919. Please don't try this at home. So let's start with the exchange rate. Approximately 1 penny of American will get you about 10 lira in Italy. In America, an international reply coupon would cost you 5 cents. In Italy, that exact same coupon would cost you only 2 lira, which means that for every coupon you bought here in America, you could get 5 coupons in Italy. He decides to run an experiment. He takes $1 and he sends it to an uncle of his back in Italy. The uncle takes the $1, thanks to the exchange rate and the cost of the coupons in Italy, gets 66 international reply coupons, which he mails back to his nephew in Boston. The nephew has $3.30 worth of coupons because he can exchange them for 5-cent stamps. Well, after you account for giving the uncle back in Italy a few dollars and then paying people, giving them a few cents on the dollar so they would accept the stamps because stamps are not legal tender in America, he ended up with $2.10 from the initial $1 that he invested. Okay, I don't have an MBA, but even I can figure out 210% profit is pretty damn good, and it only took about 2 weeks to do so. Ponzi immediately has these certificates printed up for a brand new company, and the name of the company is just delicious in its irony. It was called the Securities Exchange Company. Let's say it together, the SEC. So he decides to offer this outrageous return on the dollar. He would offer 45% return in just 90 days. Imagine that, 45% in just 3 months. And he sells a certificate, a $50 certificate, to a factory foreman in South Boston. Slowly, word begins to spread, and by January of 1920, he has sold $870 worth of coupons. And now word begins to spread about this man, this fellow Italian immigrant who was offering these great returns. Ponzi himself would use the coupons to pay for meat and bread and even to buy some jewelry for his beloved Rose. Things were going so well that in February, having over $5,000 of investors, he has to hire a secretary. That is one Lucy Melly, who was a brand new graduate of a new secretarial school in the city of Boston. Then in February, after he hires Miss Melly, he comes up with a terrific marketing plan. To increase traffic, he pays off his first investors early. Now things really start to take off. It's the best marketing of all, this word of mouth spreading throughout the immigrant community. He has to hire clerks to keep up with the crowds that are now beginning to form in his office up there at 27 School Street, which, by the way, was right next door to City Hall. They started keeping investor information on little note cards. And by the way, up to this point, it was all a cash business. I mean, they were taking cash and stuffing them into trash barrels, into file cabinets, but the money is pouring in. He even ups the return, offering 50% return in just 45 days and 100% in 90 days. That means he would offer you 4 times your initial investment in just 1 year. And the money just keeps rolling in. Soon, as I mentioned, he has to hire clerks to keep up with the crowd. And they are forming outside his office at lunchtime and outside the building. And finally, somebody asks, what are all those immigrants doing on School Street every damn day, lining up at 27 School Street? So the police investigate. And a policeman and some of his minions dutifully makes his way up to the 5th floor of the building. They sit down with Mr. Ponzi. He explains how he's making all this money from postal coupons. And you know what happened? Yep, the cops bought certificates. And now Ponzi had a de facto security team because these police officers wanted to be sure that their investment was safe. But what's really interesting now, and I mentioned James Michael Curley, who was the mayor of Boston a couple of terms before Ponzi arrived, how he had helped split the Yankees away from the Irish and the other immigrants, even more than they had already been. It's interesting that there was no interest in what was going on in School Street beyond the immigrant or working class. In fact, reporters from one of Boston's 8 major dailies who were just around the corner on Washington Street as they fought their way through these crowds to get to lunch in Scollay Square, they never asked, gee, I wonder what all these people are doing here. All right. The fun thing about history is that it can often be like dominoes. You know how you line dominoes up, and when you knock down the first one, the others start to fall? Well, now the first domino starts to fall, because in March of 1920, these 3 countries in Europe pulled out of the International Reply Coupon Agreement. Now, the problem in Italy, of course, was this is supposedly where all his contacts were, all of his relatives. Romania had a great exchange rate, and in France, stamps were legal tender. This information got the attention of the chief postal inspector here in Boston. That's the beautiful post office building in Boston's Post Office Square. So the post office inspector, he makes his way down to 27th School Street. He trudges up those 5 flights of stairs. He sits down with Mr. Ponzi, who explains the postal coupon idea. And what do you think happened? You got it. The inspector and his cohorts, they all bought certificates in Mr. Ponzi's company. It's almost like having a government approval to be able to say that the post office, a branch of the US government, is even investing in my company. And you can see by April of 1920, he's collected over $140,000 in certificates. Get ready for another domino. Because remember back in Montreal, I told you about this friend of Ponzi's named Scarpini? He's the one who told Ponzi, go ahead, cash that forged check. I won't say anything. And then he turns Ponzi in. Well, Scarpini suddenly just shows up out of the blue. He must have heard somewhere that there was this guy down in Boston who was making all this money. And he shows up, he sees his old friend Ponzi, and Mr. Ponzi suddenly decides, this guy Scarpini, he would make a great manager for my New Hampshire office. And while we're at it, I'll give you a free car as a way so you can get around. So that took of Scarpini. But it kind of, well, it got Ponzi a bit nervous. And so he decided that all this money being stuffed into trash cans and stuffed into file cabinets, maybe that wasn't the best way for him to save his money. So he started putting his money in local banks, including the Hanover Trust. And then in the same month, he decides he's going to start paying off his mature certificates, not in cash, but in checks paid from the banks. But things are going really well. And here's your Lexington connection, folks, because in late April of 1920, Charles Ponzi bought this home in Lexington, Massachusetts. He had 6 servants, and that doesn't count the chauffeur he hired for his new locomobile. That month, Charles Ponzi also got to live an immigrant American's dream, in which he brought his sainted mother, whom he hadn't seen for 17 years. He brought her over from Italy, so she should enjoy with him the luxury that was his Lexington home. I love this picture. Historians use many different sources to figure out not just what happened, but how people were feeling. Let's look at this picture and see how people are feeling. Look at Charles and Rose, the love, the passion in their eyes as they look at each other. And look at the daggers that Mama Ponzi is giving her new daughter-in-law. Love that picture. Charles Ponzi starts to make some interesting purchases around this time. He bought a construction company. He bought a macaroni manufacturer. He started buying stocks in banks. We today would call that diversifying our portfolio. He also, and this is one of those strange things that's contradictory about, because we're talking about a man who clearly was a crook, was a thief, but he bought a $3 million insurance policy, which in the case of his death meant that all of his investors would be paid off. Maybe it was a marketing ploy. I mean, it, as the kids would say, it added to his street cred, and it vaulted his intake of money even higher, over $440,000. But look, you don't need an MBA to figure out the awful truth, because you know what I know, what only Charles Ponzi knew, is that he wasn't dealing in IRC's, International Reply Coupons, at all. It was a classic pyramid scheme. Every dollar that came into the SEC would be $2 he had to pay out to earlier investors. Literally, robbing Peter to pay Paul. and eventually you run out of Peters, and there's your awful truth. If you've taken in $440,000, you're going to owe almost $900,000, which puts him about $500,000 in the hole. What he needs is an infusion of cash. What he wants is to pay off those investors and get out with a couple of $100,000 in his pocket. Now, he has a plan. The Hanover Trust president was a fellow named Chemerinsky, who was a bit of a braggart and used to tell people how he had ties to the upper echelons of the Polish government. So Ponzi goes to Chemerinsky and wants him to talk to the Poles to sell him $10 million in certificates. He would take delivery over 6 months, and then he would cash them out. They actually went and got the opinion of the U.S. postmaster, who not only said it was legal, but said that the post office would immediately redeem $1 million worth of certificates. Ponzi was excited. He was happy. It looked like he had a way out. But Chemerinsky gets cold feet. And Charles Ponzi is furious. And he's going to use that anger in a short while. Meanwhile, the money is rolling in. His debt is now doubled. $2.5 million in the hole. So now, part revenge, part desperation, Charles Ponzi meets with the Hanover board, telling him he wants to buy controlling shares in the bank. Now, they refuse. There's no way they're going to let this uncultured immigrant take over this bedrock institution in Boston. But the guy's got a lot of money in their bank, so they agree to sell him just enough, but short of a majority of stock. What they didn't know is that Ponzi had lined up the votes of 6 other stockholders, and now he had 53%, a controlling interest in the bank, and now Mr. Charles Ponzi, after owing a furniture dealer an IOU for $50 worth of furniture, is now the director of one of the largest banks in Boston. He likes to point out that he could have cut and run at this point. He could have stuffed a whole bunch of the bank's money in a valise, and he and Rose would have been off into the night, never to be found. But he didn't, because he thought with the bank directorship, things were going well. But I mentioned that furniture dealer. Well, Ponzi had paid off the IOU with all the interest that came with it. But on July 3rd of 1920, just a few days from now, 100 years, the furniture dealer filed a $1 million lawsuit. He claimed the IOU made him an investor in the original SEC and entitled him to a share of the profits. Now, whether or not this was just a scam of the legal system doesn't matter. He filed the papers, and that froze Ponzi's assets. So he literally was running through town, beating the guys with the papers that they were serving to each bank. No fax machines, no email. Everything got hand delivered. Ponzi is racing to places like the Hanover Bank to retrieve as much money as he can before the regulators freeze everything. He also hires a well-known defense attorney, a fellow named Arthur Hill. Well, $1 million lawsuit gets the attention of even the newspapers that heretofore had not really cared about what was going on in School Street. This is Edwin Grosier. He is the son of the owner of the Boston Post. He was the editor of the Boston Post. Wonder how he got that job. Anyway, the Post was located right around the corner from School Street here on Washington Street. It used to be known as Newspaper Row because so many of Boston's dailies were located there. Grosier dispatches a reporter to interview Charles Ponzi. And the next day, there was a story in the July 4th, 1920 newspaper in which Ponzi claims he has $2 million in assets. Well, what do you think happened Monday morning when Charles Ponzi unlocked the doors to the SEC. Yeah, there was a huge crowd outside 27 School Street, and some were there to withdraw, but most of these people were there to buy. The logic being, only a rich man could be sued for $1 million. Now you can see things are getting really bad because he sold over $6 million in certificates and he's $12 million in the hole. Or hey, he's $6 million in the hole because he owes a total of over $12 million. But Ponzi still has that bank directorship. His assets may have been frozen, but with a new account, any new money coming in, he can use for his company. So he engineers a contest to bring new investors into the bank. Now, this was something that was really not unheard of back then. Like lawyers and doctors back then, banks didn't advertise. It was considered something that was just not done. But he did manage to convince the Hanover board to let him run this contest in which new investors could be offered a prize if they brought in more of their fellow investors. To help promote the contest, get ready for another domino. He hires this guy, a former newspaperman who became a public relations man. It was a new field, public relations, back then. Guy's name was Bill McMasters, and he was actually pretty good because McMasters started getting articles published in local papers. Ironically, one of them was the Boston Post, the very paper that blew the lid on the $1 million lawsuit. And it was a very positive story, as you can see. The man doubles money within 3 months. He was so good, he got this puff piece. Then McMasters convinces Ponzi to go into the lion's den. He convinces Charles Ponzi to meet with the Attorney General and the bank commissioner. I mean, look at those faces. What does Ponzi have to worry about? You want to take a guess of what happened after the meeting of the Attorney General, the bank commissioner, and members of their staff? Several of the AG's lawyers and some of the bank commissioner's people, they bought certificates in Charles Ponzi's company. McMasters arranges for another positive story in the paper. Ponzi becomes known as the Pied Piper of School Street. A story appears with quotes from, quote, New York financiers proclaiming Charles Ponzi's a genius. Crowds are spilling out the door. Ponzi is cheered as he walks his way to work. 3 cheers for the greatest Italian who ever lived. What about Marconi? Ponzi replies. He invented radio. Yeah, but you invented money. So things are going really well. And then the Boston Post, which is the most schizophrenic paper in Boston, because now they post this very negative story from a quote from a guy named Clarence Barron. You may have heard of a weekly newspaper he came out with, Barron's Weekly, which became one of the Bibles of the financial industry for decades. He asked a question, the most devastating question he could possibly ask, one that I'm sure some of you may have been asking yourself. Why does Charles Ponzi, who gives 400% a year, put his money into banks only giving 4.5% interest? It's a great question, to which Ponzi has no direct answer except to sue Clarence Barron for $5 million. And then he boldly states that the money he makes from the lawsuit, he's going to give to charity. Well, now the DA, another Yankee, by the way, he gets involved as well. This is William Pelletier. He joins with the Attorney General. He joins with the bank commissioner. And they go to Charles Ponzi, and they request him to stop selling certificates while his books are being examined. Now, Charles Ponzi still has to pay off those mature certificates or refund money for anybody who wants out. This is a good thing. I mean, let's take one of those dominoes that's about to fall and steady it up there, because as long as he can pay off, that's fewer certificates he'll owe $2 on later on. So he's actually saving future money by the government telling him, don't sell any more certificates. But word spreads of the investigation, and there are more stories in the paper. Now the public is starting to get a little worried and maybe not as confident about Charles Ponzi. There's a $3 million run. Now, many people were cashing in their certificates, but the good thing was they were doing so before they were mature. That meant for every certificate dollar that they took out early, he would save himself another dollar. So he's flattening that doubling curve that he was dealing with. So as long as he pays people off, there's really no criminal case against him. So things are looking up. But let's take that domino we steadied and kind of flick it over, because now the Hanover board, seeing all this bad publicity, seeing all these negative stories, they get nervous. They think Ponzi might cut and run. So they force him to buy a $1 million certificate of deposit. Now, that's money that Charles Ponzi really can't afford to spend, but the board of directors, now having a little more power with all the negative publicity, they force his hand and they force him to buy that certificate. Then, a few days later, another article appears in the Post which details the difficulty that authorities are having figuring out Charles Ponzi's books. In fact, I think they buried the lead, because they had this quote from the New York postmaster, who said there were literally not enough coupons in the entire world to account for Ponzi's profits. In fact, he checked the ledger, and in the New York, New England region, in the past 3 months, they'd only sold $360 worth of certificates, those IRCs. And that finally got the attention of this guy. Days away from the vice presidential nomination, Governor Calvin Coolidge orders Edwin Pride, a renowned accountant in Boston, to go over Ponzi's books. And now comes another, you can't make this up event in our story. Because the next day, another article appears in the Boston Post stating that Ponzi is $4.5 million in debt. The byline of the story is William McMasters. That's right. Ponzi's personal public relations man was just aching to get back into the newspaper business, and he penned this article for his rival Boston Post. You can't trust PR people. And now it's front page news. There's another great run, and somehow, Ponzi manages to survive another 3-day run on his business. But he needs more money to keep paying out. Remember, as long as he pays out these certificates, they can't arrest him. But then things start to happen so fast, it's hard to keep up. On August 8th, Ponzi bribes several members of the Hanover board so he can borrow against that certificate of deposit. Now that was illegal then, it's illegal now. But now he has enough cash to keep going until the audit is done. He also has figured out a way to, let's say, borrow a few dollars to cover his $4.5 million shortfall, which, by the way, McMasters was totally right. That's how much Ponzi was in the hole. But he was going to use money from the Hanover Bank as kind of a bridge loan. But then on August 9th, Edwin Grosier, the crusading editor of the Boston Post, he gets a phone call. Who knows? Maybe from Scarpini, maybe from Zarossi. But he hears about what happened in Montreal, that a man named Charles Ponzi was arrested, convicted, and spent 2 years in prison for check forgery. So Grosier calls the Montreal police, and they're going to send him a mugshot of their Carlo Ponzi. And remember, no fax, no email. It's going by, it's going by hand, probably being driven down from Montreal down to Boston. So Edwin Grosser, doing his due diligence as a good journalist, he calls Charles Ponzi for a comment. And for the first time, perhaps in his whole life, Charles Ponzi has nothing to say. All he can do is hope that the audit is completed before the mugshot gets printed. His thinking was that once auditors said that Charles Ponzi was solvent, it wouldn't matter what he had done back in Montreal. There was an indiscretion of youth. He could easily talk his way out of that. But the same day, and here's a little bit of luck, maybe the last bit of luck Charles Ponzi would ever have. Edwin Pride is having so much trouble figuring out the books that he tells Ponzi to shut down completely. Well, this is great news. The leak is stopped. The government is saying you can't give away any more money. And Ponzi can say, hey, people, I wanted to cash out your coupons, but the government won't let me. On August 10th, the bank commissioner, old happy Joseph Allen, he gets wind of the bribe of the Hanover board, and he orders the bank to shut down for an investigation. And that's, of course, the worst possible news, because now Ponzi doesn't have a source of money to cover the $4.5 million shortfall. By this point, it doesn't matter. Ponzi's mugshot runs in the Post, and Charles Ponzi has a visitor the next day, Edwin Pride, who calls Ponzi to his office to go over the audit, as it's told in the papers and even in Ponzi's autobiography. Edwin Pride says, quote, "You are $4.5 million in the red. Have you the funds to cover the shortfall?" "No," replies Ponzi, who turns to the U.S. Marshal standing in the back of the office and says, quote, "I guess this means I am your prisoner." This was the biggest story since that molasses flood back in January. Now, Ponzi was first tried by the federal government, and he was convicted. He was released. It was the plan of the state of Massachusetts to then try him on several broken state statutes. But Charles Ponzi jumped bail, and he runs to Florida, where I am not making this up, he becomes involved in the Florida land boom, and he's selling property that was literally underwater. As he felt the noose tightening around his neck, he decided to fake his suicide by leaving his clothes on a Jacksonville beach. He hops a steamer for New Orleans. For some inexplicable reason, he tells one of his shipmates who he is, and the shipmate turns him in, and a sheriff is waiting for Charles Ponzi in New Orleans. He's sent back to Boston, where he serves time here at the Charlestown State Prison, where later Sacco and Vanzetti would be executed, and also Malcolm X would later spend time at this jail. In 1934, released by the state, Charles Ponzi is deported by the federal government. In 1939, he moved to Brazil, where he worked for this man. Not exactly a good retirement plan, working for Benito Mussolini. Charles Ponzi, let's see, he sold food from a cart. He actually ran a brothel for a while. And he wound up in a charity ward where he passed in 1948 at the age of 71. Ponzi's beloved Rose divorced him after his deportation. She had an interesting life too. She working as a collector for the local mob. And among the many places where she picked up protection money was the Coconut Grove, where she was just hours before the 1942 fire that would kill 492 people. He later worked in New York for a nightclub owner, a guy named Lou Walters, whose daughter Barbara actually remembers Rose Ponzi. For his work on the Ponzi scheme, Edwin Grosier's Boston Post would win the first Pulitzer Prize for its coverage of the Ponzi scheme. Of the investors, the lucky ones got back a few cents in the dollar. Most walked away having lost everything. And the rest of us, well, I like to think we got smarter. We got wiser. I mean, there's no way we would ever fall for such an obviously crooked Ponzi scheme, is there? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending tonight. I guess we'll take some questions if that's possible with this many people. I'm happy to.
Yeah, feel free to write questions using the Q&A function.
Mm-hmm.
We do have two right now. There was that had come in during the program. One is, what was the address in Lexington, if you happen to know it?
I don't have that at the top of my head. I have it somewhere in my notes.
Yeah, maybe we can include that in the recap that we'll send out in the email to everybody. And then someone also asked, just to clarify, he never bought the coupons from the beginning?
No, the only coupons that he ever bought were the dollar's worth of coupons that he had his uncle back in Parma send to him back in 1919.
It looks like also somebody just said 19 Slocum Road happens to be the house. So I'm glad that this town would know.
I'm sure. Yeah, well, there you go. And I'm sure the people who live there now are just going to be delighted to have tourists coming by their house.
Well, we got a bunch more questions. So let's see. At what stage in his life did Ponzi pen his autobiography? Who published it, and did he profit from it at all?
It was self-published, and it came out, according to the copyright, it was done in 1936. He penned, it was, like a lot of men, he wrote in prison, but it was a self-published book. Don't ask me where he got the money.
And another question is, did he ever apologize to people?
No. And in his autobiography, he maintained that, all along he was if the authorities had just let him be, everyone would have gotten paid and nobody would have lost money. It's a beautiful piece of delusional literature.
There's a couple more questions so far, but someone did say in the chat, I just have to say this out loud. The house is for sale, and it's currently for sale for $3,975,000.
Now if Ponzi had the money, he could have paid off. He could have shown Edwin Pride he had the money to cover the shortfall.
Right.
I love it.
Okay. So, until the countries ended their postal coupons, everything was legal?
Yes. Even after those three countries, the International Reply Coupon Agreement ended. Of course, the World War didn't help. And then post-war with the United Nations, there was a new system set up.
Another question, did the people who bought his certificates know it was based on postal coupons?
That's what they were told. He had a secret plan. He was making money from coupons. That's all they knew.
The next one is, did he have any children?
He did not, and neither did Rose. After she remarried, but they never had kids.
Wow. This is a good one. Oh, they're all good, but I'm interested, especially in this. Besides Bernie Madoff, have there been other notable Ponzi schemes?
One of the greatest, and I'm sorry I don't remember her name, but it was executed by a woman in I think it was Kentucky, and she did her scam sometime in the 1870s or 1880s. There was another very famous one called, he was known as 100% Miller, because he would double your money in a certain period of time. Some of you might remember in the late 1980s, early 1900s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Yugoslavia broke apart, and Albania specifically became suddenly, not under the sphere of influence, the entire country was literally taken by a pyramid scheme, and the economy crashed because of the investments that the government made in this pyramid scheme. So it's been with us, and then Mr. Madoff is just the latest example of some people making unfortunate decisions.
Thank you, everyone, because you're all asking a lot of great questions, and more are coming in. Another one was, how long was Ponzi in jail? I think you did cover that, but if you want to clarify again.
Well, so he was convicted in 1921 by the feds, and then again he skipped when he was let out in 26, and they got him back in 27, so another 7 years. So probably, I guess, a total of 7 plus 6 is 13.
Next question is, what happened to his mother?
I don't know. No one's ever asked. That makes me kind of a cad, doesn't it? I didn't even think about the poor mother. I'm going to have to, oh, great. Well, write that down. Find out what happened to the mother. That's a great question. It's a sure bet she didn't go live with Rose.
The next one is, what happened to the insurance policy?
My guess is it was voided because the money that he used to buy the insurance policy was money that had to be taken to pay off the investors. And, one of the debtors would have been the insurance company. So they might have even gotten a piece of whatever was left over.
Maybe this can be our last question, though people are more than welcome to continue asking questions. But what was your inspiration for diving deep into the Ponzi history?
I don't remember exactly where I heard the story. I have a pretty good library of books on Boston history, and he certainly gets mentioned here and there. In the same way that I discovered Scollay Square, which was the topic of the first book I had published, seeing there's a paragraph in a book describing a person or a place, and I go, oh, that's really interesting. Let me go see if there's a book on that. And there was a book, but it was not a very good book. And so I started talking with a friend of mine. He's it turns out he's a television producer. He's produced plays. He had something actually produced on Broadway. And this is many years ago. We just started talking about Charles Ponzi, and I said, boy, that would make a great screenplay. So he had experience writing screenplays. I had experience doing research. So we just got together and co-wrote this screenplay and tried to get it sold. Didn't get sold. So
maybe one day, though.
Producer, yeah. Because we'll probably have to do the script like on a Zoom thing. So I don't know how well that would work.
Oh, sorry. Somebody just asked. I should have spotlit you after during all these questions. I'm sorry about that, everyone.
That's okay.
The grinning Bernie Madoff probably is not the best image for that. But let's see. Do we have any information about their lives in Lexington And were the Ponzis involved with civic affairs?
No, although, you know, Ponzi liked to consider himself a man of charity. So he was always giving money to, and making a big deal about it, money to orphanages. But I don't believe they got terribly involved here in Lexington. No.
Okay. Sorry about the technical difficulties to those of you who said it in the chat. Can't seem to resolve. But are there any other questions while we are here? Oh, got a. Okay, there we go. Yeah, that fixed it. Well, if there are no more questions, I want to thank you, David, and thank you, Sarah, as well. That was a fascinating talk, and I had no idea, that it hit so close to home. I mean, I've always known of the Ponzi scheme, but.
Oh, I thank you very much. Again, thank the library, thank the Historical Society, and thank you all out there in Zoom land for attending tonight. I had fun. Thank you.